Kia ora koutou. It's lovely having such a diverse audience here today and colleagues from various parts of the university and various parts of the non-university, which is really special as well. So thank you for coming. And of course, staff and students from the centre as well. So kia ora, it's lovely to be here with you. Just before I start, does anybody know where this photo might have been taken? I'm asking you that because I'm interested in you thinking about what are the clues you're looking for in this photo to decide where it is. So are you looking at the nature of the park? Are you looking at the clothes people are wearing, their forms of transport, the shape of their moustache, what they're drinking, how they're clustering? All of these are cultural attributes. All of these are signalling something to us about who these people are and where it is. This happens to be Dresden in Germany, where I was a few years ago for a conference, and I just love this guy's moustache. Anyway, what I'm going to be talking about today is really a work in progress. So I'm lucky enough to be on sabbatical this year. So as of the 1st of February, I have had a reprieve from being director of this research centre, which I did for 10 years, and time to just slow down a little bit and think and read, just immersing myself back into the literature that I'm writing a book about. So the book is about culture and sustainability, and this is a space that I've been doing research and writing papers and working with research students and just generally exploring for a number of years, initially from an energy perspective, then more generally across sustainability, looking at the relationship between culture and sustainability. And now is the time to write a book, not just about the work that I and the teams I've worked with are doing, but also other people who've picked up on these ideas and have been applying them elsewhere in the world. But it was kind of a bit of a humbling and salutary experience to then, although I've been working in this space, there's always more you can learn, more you can read, more inspiration that you can draw from other academics. And so I essentially forced myself to read back through what was sometimes 150 years worth of literature over a long period of time. And for a long time when you do that, as PhD students will know, you feel completely lost. You feel completely bogged down. You can't see the pictures, you can't see the shapes of what you're doing, and you think, what on earth can I contribute in this field that so many people have worked in before? And then eventually you kind of stagger out the far side, and I feel like I've hit a little bit of solid ground, and I'm writing, but the pleasure for me is that in actually developing this talk even, I've had a few more insights into what I might be doing with this book and more generally with my thinking about culture and sustainability. So, Jefferson, this is a better word. It's not working. Okay, I'll just use the arrow. It's still not working.
On the presentation, yeah. It's in Zoom rather than the PowerPoint.
Show me.
Yeah, I don't see that.
I think it will just be that, and now it will work.
Right. So I'm not going to talk a lot about what I mean by sustainability. I think we all know that we are facing some hugely difficult questions as a globe and as a nation. Difficult questions about the impacts of climate change on human beings now and into the future. Questions about the acceleration of climate change, despite all of our best efforts to stop it, pollution, the impact on economies, the impact on wildlife, etc., etc. The sustainability problem and the scale of it is incredibly evident. And we know what we have to do. We really know what we have to do. And we're churning away saying, actually, Here's yet another report that gives us insights into why biodiversity is so important. Here's yet another conference which is going to try to encourage human beings and nations to take some serious action. Here are our sustainable development goals. We've got to achieve these by a certain date. Within Aotearoa, here are the kinds of things we're going to need to do. The Climate Change Commission has just come out with its report on our progress towards a more low carbon future. But all of that is predicated on human beings doing stuff differently. And that's where the difficulty arises. And it is really about the fact that almost all actions we undertake are actually within a social context. So this is me, and there's a whole lot of other people out there too, but I don't act alone. Everything I do is within a culture that I'm part of, and that culture could be the culture of my family and my extended family, the culture of the people I go and climb in mountains with, the culture of the centre here, the Centre for Sustainability. We've got a certain culture, and maybe the culture of being a Kiwi. And all of those things are sets of rules and understandings about how I behave in those contexts. And I can go a little bit outside of those kind of rules, but if I went too far outside, I'd be ostracised. I would not be comfortable. And so my tendency is to always try and work within those multiple cultures of which I'm a part. So although my genetic inheritance and certain things about, I guess, my childhood experiences and the way that my brain operates does make me an individual, most of my actions and aspirations and decisions are shaped through my social lives and my social context and the way that I'm interacting with other people continuously. And so my point here is that we act culturally, and this is something that is not yet well understood in terms of the kind of push there is for change. So we kind of instinctively know that we act culturally. And you are always seeing phrases like, we need a culture change in order to address sustainability problems. But it's used in a kind of in a despairing way. It's like, actually, we need a culture change, but where will that come from? But at the same time, all of these models and forecasts and policies that we see are pretty much all predicated on this kind of technical potential idea. Like, technically, we could all have EVs tomorrow, and technically, New Zealand could be 100% renewable electricity generation. It's based on economic modelling, and importantly, it's also based on this idea that we act as individuals, we act as rational individuals, and we're all really well informed. And if we're not acting rationally, it's because we're not well enough informed. Well, we know that's not true, because if those things were true, then all of these policies and reports would have actually been enacted, but they're not. But the trouble is, culture is not an easily accessible concept. Oh, that's right, that's not working. I have to use this one. So from a lay perspective, it tends to be used to mean kind of everything that's collective, or it means other, it means those people over there who are different from me here or us here. And it's used to talk about things that are mystifying and things that are difficult to change. It's kind of like a blanket idea, that like spreading Marmite over a piece of toast, like you just put it there and it's there, but it's not actually going to change into what it is. But anyway, but in my perspective, that kind of this sort of lay generic problematizing approach to culture isn't really helpful when the thing you want to do is actually enable change towards a more sustainable future. And you get academics who, for one reason or another, actually are incredibly critical of lay perspectives or media perspectives, in particular on culture. And so facile, uninformed, dangerous are some of the words that come through. And that's fair enough. That is fair enough. But on the other hand, it's really unhelpful. It's unhelpful because it creates division and creates a sort of sense of superiority that here we are as academics and we actually know what culture means, but those unwashed people down there don't. But it's kind of unsurprising that normal people don't understand culture. So this is one definition by Orlando Patterson, who I think is great. He's brilliant. He's a really intelligent, insightful commentator. But his description of culture is a dynamically stable process of collectively made, reproduced, and unevenly shared knowledge structures that are informational and meaningful, internally embodied and externally represented, and that provide predictability, coordination, equilibria, continuity, and meaning in human actions and interactions. And he's quite right. But who is going to make sense of that in a lay perspective or in a policy perspective? And then how are they going to apply that to finding a solution? So it's kind of unhelpful for academics, non-academics, and also for many academics as well. And also, and many of you will be aware of this, there's an enormous academic divergence and often disagreement about what culture means, how we analyse it, how we understand it, how we apply different ideas around culture. And this is just some of them, not all. And so each of these particular, theoretical perspectives is taking a slightly different tangent on this idea of culture, or sometimes a wildly divergent tangent on this idea of culture. So that's not terribly helpful either. And also, culture is and has been an incredibly damaging concept and has been used so for a very long time. And this is not something I'm going to go into here, but I just want to acknowledge that culture has been problematic for many, many people in the world and continues to be so, as a form of domination, hegemony, division, entitlement, othering, all of those things. And I'm putting it there and I'm saying that exists, but where I'm going to take this conversation, I hope, is in a more positive direction about what can we do with culture that can actually help us deal with both sustainability issues and also that hurtful past of culture. So my big question is, how can we harness understandings of culture to the cause of sustainability transitions? And from all the reading I've been doing, it reinforces to me what a rich repository of cultural research and understandings we have over the past 150 years. But that relatively little of that has been actually applied to date to sustainability questions. And that kind of surprises me. So as part of what I want to do with this book is actually to throw the challenge out there to say, actually, let's harness this power, let's harness this intellectual activity in a way that's much more applicable to real world problems today. But also what I am seeing often in papers is these kind of candy floss understandings of culture. So you can get an entire academic article or book. They never even define what they mean by culture. They just assume that you know what it is, or it is a kind of an assumed definition. And it doesn't actually help in applying that thinking then or comparing that thinking to somebody else. So that's something else that concerns me, because if you're using these candy floss approaches, then you're not grappling with the real thing, which is something I think that we all recognise and is tangible in our lives, but where are the words to describe it? So my aspirations with the book more generally is first of all, understanding culture as a causal factor in sustainability or non-sustainability outcomes, presenting culture as an accessible concept for non-specialists rather than a cliche, which I think it is at the moment, and also offering an analytical framework that can be used by both academics and non-academics to explore sort of constraints and opportunities for sustainability transitions, looking at the social context of our action. So what I'm going to talk about today, having taken 15 minutes to get to this point, is what does culture mean as a concept? What are its attributes? And how might cultural concepts help with sustainability transitions? So first of all, what does culture actually mean? Raymond Williams talks about it as one of the 2 or 3 most complicated words in the English language, and I saw some. Why did I take this on? And then, so it's got this enormously long whakapapa or genealogy of at least 6 centuries. So a lot of evolution, a lot of influence of one idea leading to another idea, and a lot of cross-fertilisation also across European languages who've used versions of the term culture and then kind of intersected back into the mainstream. And so I kind of liken it to a braided river because new streams of thought enter and then it diverges and then comes back. And I'm hoping in this talk to sort of capture some of those key braids in the braided river that we're seeing, but being aware that these ideas are evolving as we speak all the time. So it's kind of like capturing water. And then when I realised that there were at least 150 definitions of culture by the 1950s alone, I think people have stopped counting now. It was like, ah! Anyway, I've done my best. And what I'm going to talk about now is the way in which working off other people's work and working off people like Raymond Williams and others who've made attempts to kind of group cultural understandings into kind of packages. Other people who have done this generally come up with 3 or 4 groups of definitions. I come up with 7. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. So this is really its origins, culture as nurture. So this is from way back in the 15th century, which was really its roots, and I love this root of it. It's about tending things. It's about looking after things. It's about growing crops or animals. So it's very much a hands-on process of doing stuff. And we can see that word in words like agriculture and horticulture and culturing specimens in a petri dish and so on. That meaning culture is still coming through. And then it turns from that into a metaphor, as we tend to do in languages. So to move something from a concrete idea to a metaphor. So it was sort of tending to the process of human development, whatever that might mean. And it was very much a sort of a noun of process to culture something. From the late 18th century, we also had culture emerging as a kind of a product with initially sort of very high class associations, very much sort of relating to the emerging kind of parallel emergence of the word civilization. And both of them were suggesting that there is some kind of pinnacle that human beings generally are going to reach. And of course, the Western world, and particularly England and parts of Europe, were at that pinnacle, and everybody else was expected to reach that sort of high point. And these artworks were very much sort of representing that product of the perfection of civilization. And that was very much influenced by emergences in French and German, and now we use that word and we can see it applied to kind of works of art and works of production, theatre, etc. Generally, we call those things culture. We have a Ministry of Culture and Heritage, for example, that deals with that in New Zealand. Then this sort of idea of culture as progress really took off from the 18th century around this sort of superiority thing. So this was not so much culture as encapsulated in works of art, but culture as encapsulated in kind of an intellectual and spiritual and knowledge development. And it was very much around this sort of high culture idea, but alongside that, there was this interesting kind of other emergence of culture, which was saying, really decrying industrialization and the flowering of the Enlightenment, which was all about, the importance of science and the depiction of human progress as something which was quite mechanistic. And there was a sort of revolt against it, which started idealising European sort of folkways and folklores as being culture as opposed to high culture. So there was a bit of a tension at that point. But its meaning was mostly to refer to kind of the intellectual and spiritual and aesthetic side of development rather than the material side. Then from the 19th century, and very much driven by the emerging discipline of anthropology, we had this culture as ways of life. So we're kind of shifting here from culture as a sort of something, one thing, one representation of idealized superior civilization, to recognizing that culture exists in many different forms, in many different ways. And initially it was very much in an othering sense, like there's some really weird people over there in Papua New Guinea, let's go and look at how they live. And then later on, more towards the 20th century, anthropology started turning its mind to culture within kind of Western civilization as well, and so investigating cultures within society as we know it today. But there, it's really talking about the entire way of life of a group of people or of a period. So looking at, with the assumption that all we do is live in one culture. So everything that we do is actually captured in one way of life. And that may well have been the case in some communities in the past without the kind of influences we have today. Today it's a rather a different picture. But this idea of culture as lifeways has a very strong research presence in the literature. Then from the mid-20th century, this emergence of culture as meaning started to really emerge. So here, culture was kind of divorced from the tangible and the physical, and really started, the interest was, what do these things actually mean as shared and symbolic signals about how life should be lived or how we expect life to be? So it was attempting to say, how do people make sense of and apply significance to our experience rather than what are the tangible things that we think and do in our daily lives? And so very much focused on interpretation of objects, even things like Coke bottles, discourses, texts, and images to identify the symbolism and meaning underneath those. And it became an incredibly esoteric, very rich, but very esoteric, very kind of removed from everyday life kind of academic pursuit. And one of the critiques of this is that actually it was the academics themselves actually talking about symbolism and meaning rather than possibly the symbolism and meaning as it occurred to people who were using them. So there is critique of this, but at the same time, it is an interesting kind of process of emergence of this idea of culture. And particularly what I'm interested in is how these meanings structure social action. So how the meaning of a Coke bottle actually structures the way young people, for example, might interact with each other. And the power of that was actually shown, I think, yesterday, where some famous footballer shifted two Coke bottles off the interview desk when he was being interviewed by some media and said, drink water instead, and the value of Coke dropped by like 4 million and billion or something within half an hour. So that's the symbolism that I'm talking about. That's why symbolism is so important and powerful. Then we kind of had a performative turn, and this interest in performance. So culture as performance from pretty much the late 20th century, maybe a bit earlier. But there's sort of a whole lot of ideas here that seem to be quite diverse, but they are actually all linked to this kind of performativity idea, which is that the social construction of reality is really saying that we create reality through our interactions with each other. And that is the reality that we live in and breathe, and seeing, I guess, the ontology of social life as that kind of social interaction and the results of those social interactions. Rather different from that, but still a bit kind of divorced from, in a way, the tangible world is social practice theory, which in its most, I suppose, evolved in a sense, or intangible in a sense, really says that over time we develop practices like ironing, like having a shower, like cooking meals, and those practices are in a way disembodied from human beings. They themselves exert power over humans. They recruit human beings to go and belong to them, and from time to time we can defect from them, but those practices actually are agentive. They have power on our lives. And so this social practice theory, interestingly, has been one of the theoretical streams that has been applied quite strongly to sustainability questions, as compared to many of the others. And then we have things like actor network theory, which is again quite a performative kind of set of theories, which is really saying the way we interact with the reality is really networks of relationships of stronger or less strong intent, and some of those relationships may well be with the physical objects, and things like these chairs actually are as important within a network of relations as me, myself, or my friends. And also as part of that, this sort of idea of enactment is the idea that humans, individuals, are actually enacting multiple cultures in our everyday lives, which is kind of what I was referring to right at the start there, that we shift these days between sets of cultural expectations, sets of cultural practices, sets of cultural physicalities as we move through our daily lives. So we're kind of constantly being bombarded and affected by all of those. And then finally, this one here, culture as creation, which is a really interesting emergence that is kind of hasn't really been talked about a great deal, but I'm seeing as actually really important, particularly in terms of a sustainability journey. And this is where we're seeing the intentional development of different cultures. And where you see it quite powerfully is within the organisational culture literature. So this is really kind of the business area, which is possibly why anthropologists and sociologists haven't been so interested, because that's business. But I find it really interesting because this is people putting their minds to how do we change a culture? How do we shift this culture? How do we create a new culture? There is a sort of a previous genealogy there around looking at things like youth cultures and alternative cultures, which themselves are sort of intentional creations. But this is sort of moving more into looking at culture for particular outcomes of that culture. So it's causally oriented. So that's the 7 that I've come up with. And at a kind of a glance, it's like, God, what does all that mean? How does that come together? How can we make a coherent sense of that in terms of sustainability? So what I then did was say, okay, what are the qualities that they're talking about? What are the attributes of culture that these guys are talking about? To try and see, are there similar themes or very different themes occurring across these different sort of theoretical groups? And to do that, I reviewed dozens of definitions of culture, and other people have done this too. So sometimes I was actually piggybacking on other people who'd done this. So it's kind of boring, but it's also absolutely fascinating. And so there's a few here. So here's an example of culture as lifeways, that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, law, morals, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man. This was in 1920, so this was when we were not so aware that man was excluding a lot of people as a member of society. Culture as meaning, transmitted and created content and patterns of values, ideas, and other symbolic, meaningful, oops, I think I missed out a word there. Anyway, you get the idea. Culture as performance, this is a kind of a practice theory definition that's quite well known. So a routinized type of behaviour which consists of several elements interconnected to one another, forms of bodily activity, forms of mental activity, things and their use, a background knowledge, know-how, states of emotion and motivational knowledge. And culture as creation, this is values, beliefs and norms or behavioural practices that emerge in an organisation. And my very favourite from 1948, the things that people have, the things they do and what they think. Oh, he's cutting it down to really, really nice model ideas. slightly based on that, but also based on my own work with Cultures framework, which is using a kind of a similarly cut down set of ideas. Let's run through the common ideas, in fact, all the ideas in a definitional sense and an attributional sense that were coming through all these definitions. So in terms of things people have, definitions included things, the words, art, artifacts, products, material and immaterial, so including things like computer programs, etc. So it doesn't have to be something physical, but it's stuff people make and use, tools, architecture, structures, and so on. So this is the things people have. And sort of some of the ideas about these that were coming through was that these sort of items are created in a cultural context. So they're created in their creation, they are reflecting the culture that they're developed in, and they're also ultimately reinforcing that culture because they are developed out of it. They're conveying cultural ideas and they reproduce culture as they're used and consumed. And coming through in some of these ideas is that items themselves can be actors in cultural assemblages, and this is particularly through ANT, academic network theory, but also in other theories. So the items are actually influential in their own right. They're not only just conveying culture, they're actually, they have agency. The second set of ideas and the definitions came through around things people do. So customs, routines, rituals, practices, behaviour, doing things, interactional practices, social action, and so forth. So here, the ideas coming through were, in some instances, there was a focus on just routines and habits, so the things that we do frequently and that tend to follow the same pattern. There's an interesting definition in some literature or discussion around, is it just the routines that are important, or are all actions culturally shaped and culturally influenced? I definitely think all actions are important, because even if we just do them once, there is a cultural influence. We only graduate on the stage at the town hall maybe once or twice in our lives, but that is so culturally determined and culturally shaped. So these words are, practice tends to be used to cover both of those at sometimes and sometimes one, so that's why these German words are sometimes useful, but you don't need to particularly focus on those. But as well as those, there is a focus on how people interact with each other, which I've already talked about, and the sort of intersubjectivity, which is the sort of way we mutually coordinate with each other around shared meanings and aspirations. And it's sort of continual, sort of slight negotiation that we do within a cultural context to come up with a way forward, an action, an aspiration. The next one's about how people think, and particularly around what is it that's shaping the thinking that we do and ultimately the decisions that we make. So everything from law, which is kind of a hard set of rules, to internally accepted rules of behaviour, like when we meet somebody, do we shake their hands or do we bump elbows or do we give them a cuddle? Concepts, morals, belief, customs, traditions, norms, values, symbolic devices, all of these things are sort of coming through in these definitions. And this is ultimately about these kind of learned and shared ideas about what is normal, what's correct, what's tika in a Māori sense, what is the right thing to do in the circumstance, and the meanings and the symbols that guide those right things. And behind that, sort of beliefs in how the world is and should be or could be. So the sort of expectations and aspirations. And so those rules are both formal and informal, but we kind of know them. And if we don't obey them, we're going to be somewhat on the outside. We're going to be ostracised. We're going to feel uncomfortable. You're starting to see why culture is important in sustainability transitions. And also what people know. And this is around not forms of knowledge, so everything from highly technical knowledge to the kind of knowledge that we develop just by doing, the everyday knowledge that you learn from childhood, how you brush your teeth, how you cook a meal, how you drive a car. So there's those kind of very embedded knowledge systems that are within your bones and muscles, as well as the intellectual knowledge systems that you absorb through reading and talking and writing. And language plays a really important role there too, not language necessarily in the form of English versus Māori, even though that's important, because every Māori word has a whole realm of meanings in addition to what we think of as the equivalent English word, like land and whenua, for example, and you will know this. But also, as well as those language differences and the importance of language in conveying those ideas, it is the languages we use that are technical or jargonified or specific to a place. So I will probably talk very differently with academic colleagues, so I'm not too into this, than with my family members, for example. So there's a different expectation about the kinds of language that we use. So ultimately, it is about our knowledge systems, however those have been derived, the skills and know-how that associates with that, and the language and terminology that we use. And the final thing that came through across this review of definitions was this sort of these system-like characteristics of cultural attributes, so that they are interactive, they don't sit alone, they influence each other. And that culture is a temporal thing as well. Culture is learned, reproduced, and passed over time from one person to another. Also, that cultures are not static, that they do change over time and are influenced both by other cultures and external factors. And finally, that culture groups may have blurred boundaries, but you can usually identify some core patterns, and even without being academic about it, you can as a human being, we recognise a different set of cultural characteristics when we see them. So my idea being, let's try and see all of this as a whole. In developing an integrative framework, it must reflect these qualities of culture. But at the same time, it must be able to sort of carry or be a doorway into the different ways that different disciplines understand culture. So different ontologies, what is the world that actually exists out there? Different epistemologies, different methodologies. So it's not saying there is only one way to understand culture, but it is saying let's actually look at culture as a thing rather than a whole lot of different things. And when you're developing frameworks or models, you're looking for the kind of the minimal logical structure. I quite like that phraseology. So, and you have heuristic models, which are kind of a thinkable format for reflection on your problem. And then you can have a representational model, which is a possible reality. So if you're presenting a possible reality, you're actually assuming an ontology, you're assuming a certain set of realities in the world. Heuristic is much more around, here are some ways to understand something that might be useful and might help us go further. And I think for the most part, I'm going to be talking about the heuristics. Ultimately, I'm going to talk about the model as a representational model. So I actually went back to the cultures framework and said, might this work? And it was like, Jesus, I think it does work. So this is something that I and team members have been working with over 12 years. And it's shifted a bit over time, being refined. But this is a way of understanding culture from our perspective. And essentially it is around what people have, how they think, what they do, and ultimately underpinning all of those things is this sort of knowledge, language, skills side of things. Where we've typically used it is in relation to what extent are these things causal factors in sustainability outcomes. So that's the purpose of this model, and that's still how I'm going to use it in the next few slides. So how might cultural concepts help with sustainability transitions? Let's go back and just run through those 7 again. So culture as nurture, can this concept help us in thinking about how we might reconnect with nature, develop kaitiakitanga, develop a sense of responsibility and stewardship, learn to care for, restore and regenerate our natural systems. And in terms of this model here, we're starting at the sort of practices side of things and saying, if we can get our practice right around nurturing, then that's going to feed out and start affecting other aspects of this framing. Culture as product. To what extent can we use the arts as a means to communicate sustainability issues, concepts and aspirations? It's already done, but I think there's huge potential to do this more. And this is a great carving here that I just picked up from Tufari Toa, who do renewable energy. And I just thought that was an absolutely fantastic example of how art just captures a whole set of really rich concepts around sustainability. In terms of this, so clearly we're sort of looking at this part of the model. We're looking at art as a product that then potentially can influence norms, can influence practices, and ultimately can influence sustainability outcomes. Culture as progress. So that culture as progress as originally conceived is a really reprehensible concept in my idea. It is that there's some perfect culture out there that we all need to achieve. But if we think about progress as not towards a particular set of cultural attributes, but a particular kind of outcome, then maybe that's different. And all sorts of assemblages of cultural attributes could lead to sustainability. It's not saying any single one is. So if we consider what cultures result in sustainable outcomes and which don't, this could maybe be helpful. So this is really focusing on this end of things. So any form of materiality, norms and practices, but what is the outcome we're trying to get to? And I've just got this example of an absolutely brilliant report that's come out of the agricultural sector recently, which is applying Māori concepts to what might agriculture look like in New Zealand. And in fact, it focuses on outcomes and says how do we achieve these outcomes in terms of our whenua, our wai, our ahurangi, and our koiora, so the people and animal well-being. Beautiful and really insightful piece of work. Culture as lifeways. So here it is what ways of living offer the best chance to achieve a sustainable future. And importantly, can other cultures offer insights into sustainability-oriented lifestyles? And to me, the sort of idea of mutually learning from each other about what might work or what might not, and also turning our eyes on ourselves and saying, what is it about the whole of our way of living that is delivering non-sustainable outcomes? Is it aspects of our practices? Is it something to do with our material choices, etc.? Culture as meaning, big one. To me, how can we make visible the problematic ideologies and belief systems, for example, on which overconsumption is based? So overconsumption is based on a whole creation, a set of beliefs about growth, about capitalism, about individual self-aggrandizement, about wealth, and about ignoring of the externalities of all of that activity. How can we make that really, really visible? And how can new meanings be built that align with a sustainable future? And this image here is of a collective of people who do completely life cycle managed circular economy t-shirts. So just one small example. So building into their t-shirts these sort of meanings about sustainability as a whole of life exercise. And here clearly we're looking at the side of norms and thinking if we can start shifting norms at whatever scale, whether it's local or global, then what might be the impacts then on materiality, on practices, knowledge, etc., and ultimately on sustainability outcomes. Culture as performance. So how can we change our habitual routines to become more sustainable? There's these performativity things that we do all the time. And just that image there is in New Zealand. So when we log on there, the first decision is, do we need to fly? And the second one is, do we need to offset? So if we can even get those two questions in our performance of thinking about travel, then we've made a big difference. But also, I mean, to me, as we shift between our personal cultures from one to another, are we noticing or influencing different sustainability outcomes across them? So would I do something quite different in terms of my recreational culture that I would do in my daily work culture? And yes, I do. I actually drive a vehicle to get to out-of-the-way places. That's where most of my greenhouse gas emissions are. That's really bad. But that's the performativity side of my life, is in part going into wild places and doing exciting things. So that's something I need to personally think about. And here, this is very much sort of starting with the practices side of things and starting to move through influencing others. And finally, culture as creation. This is, to me, one of the most exciting places, which is how do we actually intentionally develop new cultures as organisations, groups, individuals, as a university, to become more sustainable, and what conditions would enable this sort of rapid shift rather than a really slow one. And this regen agriculture, I think, is a really interesting example of the emergence of a sort of alternative, intentionally mastered creation of a set of ideas about how agriculture could be. And a whole lot of people starting to work towards that around developing language, knowledge, skills, new practices, new forms of materiality, etc. So the sort of culture as creation is really just trying to do a massive shift across all of these things simultaneously. So to conclude, thank goodness I haven't run over time. The analysis I've done so far, and this is really a work in progress, is saying I think there's 7 sort of key clusters of meaning across what culture, how it's been interpreted across multiple disciplines over time. And these sort of 5 key groups of attributes that come through all of these clusters. And just some interim conclusions. The first one is clearly that culture has diverse interpretations, but they are linked. They are a braided river. We can see them as a whole. There are connections between them. And they inform each other. And to me, the cultures framework was, for me personally, a useful way of sort of seeing where those links were. There will be other ways. That is one model as a heuristic, but it is one way of visualising those links. Secondly, that I think all cultural theories and the practices and the methodologies that flow from that can potentially contribute to sustainability outcomes, but currently few are doing so. And that really disappoints me. And I think I want to throw out a challenge to cultural disciplines generally, that we've got a huge amount to contribute to this really thorny question about getting to a sustainable future and working with human beings as social creatures. And in that sense, for me, again, personally, the cultures framework is an accessible way, not just for disciplines, but for others to grasp the concept of culture and to develop insights about causality and change. And lastly, the sort of integration and differentiation across cultural theories. The cultures framework, I think, can help signal what theories could potentially be usefully applied to different sustainability questions, because the framing that you use and the methods that you use is going to depend on what your question is in terms of the outcomes that I keep referring to. So that is really, I suppose, offering the cultures framework as a heuristic. We have also used it as a tangible model of reality, and there's a whole lot of work and some of this is research that we've done, research that other people have done internationally, or research that PhD students have done, and this is just a snapshot of the sorts of areas that we've applied this framing to usefully give insights into questions about shifting from a current sort of cultural state to a state of more, of better sustainability outcomes. So a huge range of possibilities, and what excites us is that the framing is applicable from a very micro level of a group of families or an organisation through to a global level around, for example, our paper on comparing nations' decarbonisation pathways. So there's further reading on the cultures framework if anybody's interested. And here's a photograph of an absolutely delightful culture, which, do any of you know where this might be? So it's on the Little Whangarui River on the west coast, and this is a whitebaiting settlement. So there's these funny little buildings in amongst the trees where people come for a few months every year and hang out and just very basic living, picking whitebait, having a beer with the mates in the evening, hanging out, and then they all go home again to their normal lives. It's, just extraordinary on our back doorstep. Anyway, that's my talk, and we have about 7 minutes left for feedback. Thank you.
Just a preliminary suggestion. So you were talking about shifting cultures. I was trying to think of examples, and they were all good books. So it seems like this is what you should be doing. So if we think about the kinds of interlocked behavior change that move cultures towards sustainability, something like Silent Spring, it didn't exhort people, go organize and change. It just said, look how this is working. Let me make this clear to you.
Yeah.
And so much followed.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, it's not a panacea, but this is sort of action I think we're talking about.
Yeah. Precisely. Thank you. Yes. Books are important. Ideas are important. Yes. I'll do my best. Yeah, Ash.
Thanks, Janet. Despite the provoking presentation, I would say, and I quite like the idea of the 7 clusters of how we can think about culture. But I'm also thinking about, in the context of your book, I mean, some of the literature you already mentioned, for example, the action network theory from Bruno, and perhaps also some of the stuff from Noel Gastry on social nature. So they also sort of like argued that whose culture it is anyway. I mean, the Western modern culture has been premised on the idea that we can separate ourselves from non-human nature.
Absolutely.
So it's predominantly an anthropocentric or human culture, and I mean that gives way for exploitation of non-human nature through factory farming and other kind of unsustainable practice. So in the context of your book, I mean, when you talk about these 7 clusters, perhaps it will be useful to sort of like position yourself, how you think about non-human nature as part of the culture or separate from it. I mean,
yeah, and in fact, it's nice that you touch on that, because it's kind of an earworm in the back of my head here as well, and thinking from a, and I didn't want to presuppose anything before climbing into it, but from many Indigenous perspectives, culture is not, as it's presented here, it is something much more interconnected. And in that sense, culture is not something that is removed from nature. As we tend to define it, we tend to sort of have these kind of bifurcations in our thinking that always says it's either one thing or another, but within a lot of Indigenous cultures, it is not. So thank you. Yes, I do need to climb into and acknowledge and explore, I think, that sort of, yeah.
maybe culture as nature can be under cluster.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I was really pleased that you highlighted organisational culture. That's been an area of interest of mine through my work for a few years, and something that fascinates me is the interaction between you know, I guess the rational side, you know, if an organisation is presented with data of different kinds, information of different kinds, that you might think might push it towards a more sustainable pathway. Yet, ultimately, my observation anyway is that it tends to be more of a cultural thing that tips the decision making among the senior levels in business organisations towards sustainability. They may have read a report to us, so we might advise them. But ultimately, it's a cultural thing. And so perhaps, you know, a fruitful area might be to sort of, you know, look into that a little bit. You know, really the triggers for those decisions in the top levels of organisations and how that works. And something that I've observed as well, and other people have sort of anecdotally told me, is around gender, particularly. So the emergence of, you know, more women being in positions of authority in organisations, either at boards or executive level, seems to have an influence on that culture and the likelihood of sustainable pathways being adopted, leading positions being adopted. So I don't know if there's anything more you might explore in there.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And Sarah Walton does some really interesting work looking at cultures amongst businesses, particularly in sort of a sustainability direction, and her work is, you know, very much in that, what does it take to trigger a change? And while, just sort of one insight from that work is that what she found through a whole series of interviews with businesses that actually had made a more sustainable change, some had started with a kind of a material change, like a bit of machinery had broken down and they got a different one, and that actually drove changes in some of their sort of normative and the practice-based aspects. Some sort of impose some kind of behavioural, so a practice change in terms of the framework, and that in itself may or may not have had much in the way of an impact, but where the big change was when there was a normative shift across the company as a whole, and they had said, okay, we've got to rethink what we do. We want to rebrand or reposition ourselves, or try to, you know, address the problems that we visibly see out there in the world, and so kind of creating a new set of strategies, aspirations, etc. So the cultural shift really coming from that point of values and beliefs and aspirations. Very rarely was it just sort of in that central space about knowledge. Knowledge, as you say, knowledge change has very, very little bearing on how people end up acting.
I wonder, to follow up on that, if there's any use of the communities of practice ideas with organizational theories, and how that is a cultural aspect for organizations to practice. Yeah, I can see that, because they themselves create this sort of the social environment within which people feel safe to talk about ideas that might be outside of the culture of their current business, and therefore and the action
that follows that. Yes, no, nice thought. Yeah, I'll take Claire first and then Claire.
Oh, thanks. That was really, really interesting. But I was thinking, in terms of achieving sustainability, what we've got is, in terms of power and ability to change, we've got this global culture of capitalism, neoliberalism, power, which almost supersedes all of those other things to some extent.
So one thing that I'm really interested in is I guess the reach, the agency of a collective culture. So to what extent is a group of people who are working towards a particular set of ends, either consciously or unconsciously, to what extent are they only just acting in their own rights, or to what extent are they able to influence the wider world? And where I see, and if you take a cultural lens on what's happening globally at the moment, you actually realise that there's some huge cultural shifts in terms of some of those old hegemonies. So the kind of battering that fossil fuel companies are having at the moment is a cultural shift that you could see the very beginnings of maybe 10 years ago with you know, calls for divestment, and it's just rolled on and it's become as a kind of a normative position of
bigger and bigger and more influential organisations and incredibly wealthy people around the world is starting to chip away at that sort of entrenched expectation that the fossil fuel industry is immune from change. And I'm not saying we're all the way there yet, but what I am saying is that there are, you can see these kind of cultural shifts starting to emerge from quite small beginnings into bigger and bigger levels of influence through collective action, really. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is obviously driven by wanting to transform or change culture. And I'm just wondering if you've considered that maybe culture is a self-organizing and emergent phenomenon that's not necessarily going to respond deterministically to any attempts to try and move it in a particular direction. I mean, personally, we can move our own values through rational thought or learning things. We can change the way we value things, but as a global society, maybe culture is something that someone can get in and say, I'm going to shift culture. It's just self-organizing, it's emergent.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I definitely think culture has system-like characteristics in that you can get completely, feedback loops and quite unexpected and often unwanted results from poking one part of a cultural enterprise and having something happen at the other end. So, and also system-like characteristics in that its tendency is to be self-organizing and self-replicating. But at the same time, we have seen, for example, with COVID, just something happen out there which has enormous impacts on our daily lives and in a cultural sense. So, Zoom meetings, we would never have imagined that we would spend so much time interacting with other people through a screen. The absence of international travel or much travel at all, that's a huge cultural shift, but it's something that may well be, the echoes of that will be felt within society for a very long time. So while culture can sometimes be very static, very hard to shift, very self-organizing.
I wasn't arguing that. I was just saying that trying to shift it in a predetermined way might be impossible because it may be self-organizing, it may be emergent. I'm not saying it doesn't evolve and transform. I'm just saying anybody's attempt to try and move it in a certain direction might not work.
Yeah. I mean, I think certainly the work that we do in specifically analysing particular situations, for example, dairy farms or people in the timber industry or people in Vanuatu adopting lighting, you can start to actually understand how that system is working and you can observe shifts. For example, with the result of a material adoption of solar lights by a particular community had impacts on daily practices, what people did, what kids did, what the woman did. It had shifts in norms away from kind of this typical use of kerosene to sort of applying sort of religious differentiation between, kerosene of the devil and sunlight of the god. And it just, so when one starts to look at culture analytically and look at its components and how they are playing against each other, and also what it is beyond the realm of that culture, beyond its agency that is shaping it, either to hold it in place or to reinforce change, you can kind of start to see how change happens and how sometimes you do get completely unexpected outcomes from a cultural shift. You can see why it's difficult, but you can also see the potential for change. And to me, that's the exciting bit. And our applications of that culture's framework to quite different contexts has actually really assisted in us seeing beyond culture as a thing into culture as a whole lot of component parts that are interacting quite vigorously with each other. Yeah, James.
Thank you. That's right. Just wondering too, in terms of, I expect that from what Amy just said, in terms of culture as well as not only coming from bottom up, but also top down approach. And in terms of, I'm thinking of people who write about China's sort of a coercive environmentalism or the like, also the re-emergence almost of the importance of the nation state and the realization of many citizens of the importance of it. Context in light of COVID, especially. I wonder if you could talk about that as well.
Gosh, you could probably talk about that better than I could.
No,
Yeah.
I was just sort of thinking sort of that way.
Yeah.
Emergent cultures sort of moving up, if you like, to influence sort of multinationals or to influence sort of national governments, but you've also got national governments the apparatus of government rules and what other structures.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Yeah. So in the work that we've done, we often pay quite a bit of attention to what those external influences are. Both, I suppose, thinking of them as kind of structure. So what is it outside there that is the sets of rules and normative affiliations and ideologies and so on that are just out there in society, either reinforcing particular cultural configurations or possibly driving change, or possibly both at the same time. And work that we've done in the energy industry and also the kind of transport industry, you can see both of those working simultaneously, and it's kind of like what's going to win. And I'm interested in the EV debate here because you can kind of see this is a big cultural shift for New Zealand if we're going to go in that direction. But at the same time, what I'm starting to think is in fact structure is just culture at another level. Okay, so once we start to get up to some of those global hegemonies, they are culture, but they're just expressed in a different way. But they're equally sets of rules and expectations and assumptions and practices and in many ways kind of material investments in certain kinds of infrastructures that are constraining us or creating change. Yeah. Gosh, we're over time. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.